I'm Emma Russell, and this is SEO in 2024.
Emma, what's your number one SEO tip for 2024?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here and do a little roll up of 2-in-1, but I would say absolutely control who has access to your content. And if you do want to give them access, then make it personal and personalized. I can break those down.
Yeah. Who are we talking about in terms of giving them access to your content? I presume that you're talking about search engines and AI as opposed to users.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I think, obviously getting your content in front of users is the main remit of why you would be creating content, and you want them to be performing an action. So I think controlling how they access that content is definitely one of the most important things that you've been doing. So if you are a news organization or a journal that produces original research, as just two examples, you can now control a little bit more which companies have access to your content. And I am, of course, referring to the new addition of the ability to block ChatGPT in your robots text file. So to unpack this recommendation a little bit further, back when we saw news organizations first joining Google and getting their news articles ranking and people using and discovering that content through Google and other search engines as well, they almost missed the opportunity at that point, although of course hindsight is 2020, of getting some kind of more formal relationship with Google and other search engines at that point, where they, in return for access to that content, could have a monetary relationship. And there is a lot of complexity around the decisions being made on whether you would want to give access or not give access. But I think at this point, we are seeing another example of where that decision absolutely needs to be made, with AI companies using that content to train their algorithms and then spit out that content as unique, even though it's not necessarily unique, and not necessarily crediting the organization that created that content in the first place. That is absolutely vital. And if you need to make that decision, then I would suggest making it now. And this doesn't just impact news organizations either. I think every single business should be having this talk and this discussion with SEOs who keep abreast of this topic, but at a company level, whether you want to give access and help these AI companies train their algorithms, train how they're creating this content.
Are there any particular types of content that you can say generically are a good idea to block ChatGPT from accessing?
Yeah, definitely. So news is probably the most obvious one, or any kind of original research. So something that might feature in a journal, an academic journal, for example. I think also something that might be event-based. So let's say, for example, you are an aggregator of events in a specific niche, then it might be worth blocking ChatGPT. But of course, that is a decision that you would want to involve other people than SEOs in. However, I would personally lean towards blocking at that point. There are lots and lots of different organizations that would also want to take a moral stand on it, and whether you want to give them access to this content free of charge or generally access to this content. Do you want me to unpack a little bit of the second half of the statement?
Yes, please. Can I just ask one brief follow-up question? Just first of all, is there any downside to blocking your content?
Yes, potentially. Although it is, of course, a classic case of it depends with SEO, as with everything. I think that it would almost depend on how ChatGPT and Google continue to grow and be used. If we start to see Google being less used, then you might want to see how something like ChatGPT develops, or Bard, because different companies are crediting sources in different ways. Something like ChatGPT doesn't necessarily give access. However, if you ask it questions like, what is a good food to give my dog with a sensitive stomach? That is the kind of query that you would definitely want to be appearing in if that is what you provide. And so at a brand level, it is absolutely worth being known. And so giving access and nuanced access perhaps to your content might be a good idea. So take, for example, this events company. If you have activity listing pages, you may not want ChatGPT to be accessing those. However, if you have marketing content on that site, you might want to give them access because you might still want to be appearing in different kinds of searches. So, for example, if you want to be ranking for, I want to run a 10K, how do I book this? You would want to be recommended. However, if somebody wanted a list of all the 10Ks in their area, then you wouldn't necessarily want ChatGPT to be able to give a good answer for this. You would want them to be able to go to the site. However, you never really know how it's going to develop. And so ChatGPT might actually be moving in a slightly different directions where it starts citing things slightly more. So I think it's one of those things where you might want to see how it develops and how usership goes and how these tools develop as well.
Great. Okay. So the way that I would probably take that is if I chose to offer all of my content for AI to consume, then I would probably try to subtly mention my brand throughout the content. So if they do display the content for various answers in different places, then that way I may get some source of traffic from that. However, if I was going to block content, I would probably be tempted to block mid-funnel content. So top of funnel, generic keyword phrases, perhaps assisting with traffic generation. But mid-funnel, you'd hope people would be coming back to you and in the consideration phase. And you don't want people to consume that content off your site. Would that be a reasonable summary?
Yeah, essentially you want to retain your USP. You want to be able to provide people with the value that what your business does. Information isn't necessarily exactly what your business might be doing, but the service is. And so you want to protect that and you want to keep that or at least be credited for that and cited.
Understood. And would you like to unpack that second part of your advice?
Yes, the cheeky additional point of making your content personal and personalized. Of course, as we see AI coming into searches a lot more with the still in beta version of SGE, Google are kind of supplementing that with a much more human feel over in the perspectives tabs. And of course, with highlighting things like experience and wanting a more personal experience of the content that it actually ranks. And so you've got two sides of the coin, one where it's purely informational from an AI tool. And it, in some cases where it might be incorrect or the user may not trust the information and they want more, they want a human touch to it. And so Google are building that in. And we're seeing huge moves and a lot of different moves from the core algorithm update that we just saw to the helpful content update that's happening now to make it more personal. And so if you want to be creating content and getting it to rank, I think it's absolutely worth keeping this in mind and also going a step further and making it slightly more personalized, not necessarily with personalization on that site with recommendations on when they go next and things like that, but thinking about how individuals want to digest information. So say, for example, you have video content and you want that page to rank, absolutely have a transcription for that content because not everybody likes video. And vice versa, if you have written content where actually you might need to show somebody something, have images, have video, and make sure that it is more personal and user-friendly for the audience that are coming to your site and digesting that information.
So are you suggesting having more personalized content on every piece of content that you happen to publish? So on every piece of content, you'd incorporate maybe a video and some relative information about someone's experience with a product, for example? Or would you have one piece of content maybe designed for a factual answer and perhaps for inclusion within an AI answer, and then other content on your site that's more personalized, ideally to go in tandem with the more factual piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So take, for example, if you have a website that is targeting small business owners to help them to develop their business. You might have one piece of content as like a main hero piece, which is like how to create a business plan for your startup. That business plan and that information isn't going to be useful for every type of business, for example. And so you might then want to delve in deeper. This is your classic hub and spoke technique. And so you might want to say, this is how you do a business plan for the food industry, creating a new product. And then here's some information from somebody who's done it before with specific recommendations, or this is what not to do. This is my specific experience with when I had this mishap with how I did my business plan, or this is how to build in flexibility into this specific business. I think that kind of information is not only going to be much more helpful to users who might see this first hero piece of content and say, I'm not entirely sure how to make that applicable to me, but also it's what Google is looking for now. And I think with Google kind of trying and making moves to try to be more helpful to users overall, I think SEOs almost need to catch up. It's certainly been an endeavor for the past few years where I know a lot of SEOs have said, don't write to try to game an algorithm or anything like that. Like, I think we're so past that now. And I think we just need to try to look further and further in the future of where this is going to go. And being as helpful as possible is absolutely it. And so that's just one example of how to take this information and run with it.
And is there an ideal platform on which to publish this more personal content? Or can we simply just publish it on YouTube, embed the YouTube video on our website and take it from there? Or do we have to be interacting on lots of other social platforms as well?
I think that's a great question. I mean, it depends on your business and your business goals. So say, for example, an SEO agency like my agency, I probably wouldn't go on TikTok, although there are probably some people doing it really well. It's just not in the strategy. It doesn't make sense. I don't see my audience being there. So even though, a video that I might have uploaded to YouTube might do quite well, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see the same result on TikTok. I think each platform requires something that is personalized to that audience that uses that platform. And sometimes that will be the same. So for example, LinkedIn, people might be wanting informational content. YouTube, they might be wanting informational content about what an SEO agency does or learnings about SEO. But I personally, if I go onto TikTok and I see somebody telling me about SEO, I'm like, absolutely not, skip immediately. And so you would need data to be informing where your audience is and what they want from each platform. Because on the flip side of that, if there was an SEO that was making jokes, admittedly, they might be a little bit cringy, but if there was an SEO comedian on TikTok, I probably wouldn't skip that immediately. So people want different things from how they use social media. I used to use Twitter as a news feed, for example. But so basically, your video won't necessarily be applicable to each social media platform, and you need data to decide, or at least help make decisions on where you should be using the content that you're creating. However, I do think that, having a YouTube video and then embedding it on your page is, even if people don't necessarily, or the data doesn't necessarily suggest that video is required for that, I still think that it is useful to have if somebody prefers to digest it using video. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the thing that gets you to rank, but I think that giving the option to digest this information in different ways on the page is still quite useful. Again, you would need to look at your own data to see if people are actually pressing play or not, and if that is a decision that you, or a thing that you want to continue doing. But I think it's definitely an idea that helps to be a little bit more useful to your audience and their different requirements and needs.
So learning point, stop publishing the same video everywhere that you can publish that video.
Yeah, because some people hate you for it.
And that has a negative impact on your brand, actually. So you're possibly having more of a negative impact by doing the work.
Yeah.
If an SEO is struggling for time, what should they stop doing right now so they can spend more time doing what you suggest in 2024?
Now I'm going to use an oldie bit of goodie here. And I wouldn't have done it, but I recalled a conference that I went to recently, and I won't name the conference, But I went to a talk and they had multiple presentations on at once. So I picked one on link building. And I think if this person had presented it in a way of, I did everything that you shouldn't do, here are the results, then that would have been a useful talk. However, what they did was, so I wanted this business to thrive, and then they went through all of the techniques of link building that you shouldn't do, from link farms to reciprocal inlinking, paying people. And then they showed the results from that as if that was the thing that you should be doing. So I just want to encourage people to read up on the modern literature and the Google Webmaster Guidelines around inlinking, because although this person actually did see some nice results, they could have been a lot better if they had done things differently. And so absolutely keep up to date with the things that are happening in SEO, because every so often you'll be surprised. Google has made the robots text file a hint, or some form of inlinking is probably not the best way to go down. So just keep up to date.
Emma Russell was founder at Oxford, Digital, where you can find her over at oxford-digital. Emma, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2024.
Thank you for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2024, the book, over at SEOin2024.com.